Hello, and welcome back to the Secret Skeleton Book Club. If you came here from my first video about Kamen Rider, I'm sorry to inform you that this video will not be about Tokusatsu. There will be no Deca Ranger discussions today, no Amazon's analysis either. Maybe next time. Today we're talking about one thing and one thing alone. Chadley. I was lucky enough to receive Final Fantasy VII Remake a full week ahead of its international release, thanks to Square Enix deciding to pull the trigger on an early shipping date in some regions to avoid possible delays caused by the ongoing plague affecting the world. Getting this game early really was a delightful distraction from the all-consuming terror of global affairs, especially given that FF7R has been one of my most anticipated titles since even before its announcement. But as this is one of my most anticipated games ever, and perhaps generally one of the most anticipated games ever, I didn't want to rush it for the sake of making this piece of content that you're seeing right now. This video is definitely releasing months after the game's release. The dust has already settled in some regard. Big outlets and content creators have published their thoughts, and a lot has been said and discussed. Now, I'm not here to drop any mind-blowing takes on this game, but I do have a lot of thoughts that I felt I needed to get out. This video will be partially my review, as well as a discussion about how the game has been received as a whole. Originally I was content to just give my thoughts and leave it at that, but a variety of things that I've seen and read over the past few weeks have really changed my perception on the game to some extent. I've seen some baffling takes on FF7R, takes that really made me confused about what people thought this game was going to be, as well as takes that made me question what video game discourse should even involve. I've also seen some compelling arguments, and ones that I didn't really think about when I was playing the game that have actually changed my perspective on it retroactively. But let's get down to brass tacks. First of all, I've seen some suggestions that FF7 Remake isn't a remake, which honestly makes no sense at all to me. I've also seen people tearing their hair out, proclaiming that this game has ruined FF7, or that this game didn't do what it was meant to do. I don't have a problem with these opinions in and of themselves, but I also don't really understand them. And I've seen a lot of arguments being made in bad faith by people trying to justify their dislike or like of the game by suggesting that the product was in some way missold or even misrepresented to them. It's got a lot to do with the 5 letters that come after the title of Final Fantasy VII. Now, it's pretty clear to me that Final Fantasy VII means one thing to a lot of people. It's obviously the 7th installment of the hit JRPG franchise, a classic video game title on the PlayStation 1, one that stars Cloud Strife and his pals Tonfa, Bayleaf, Aero, Red 13, Cat Sith, Yiffa, Versetti, and Cid on their adventure to stop Bad Man from doing bad things in a fun, funky, steampunky, sci-fi fantasy world. It's a game that redefined a genre, and one that many people hold dear. When you hear FF7, you think of all these things, probably all at once, a flood of interesting memories. You might also think of the spin-offs and the sequel, Advent Children, but let's put a pin in that for now because we'll come back to that one. Remake, however, has a less clear meaning, or at the very least, one that people seem interested in debating right now. The more I think about why the word remake was chosen to be a visible part of the title, the more I think that Square have been playing chess, while we've all been playing checkers for years. Unlike the phrase FF7, which immediately conjures up all these memories, Remake is the more clinical part of the title, but it still carries some important weight. Up until the game's release and its current reception, we understood the remake part of the title to be a sort of product designation, one that merely signals, this is Final Fantasy VII again. The cinematic history of the term remake implies having another crack at it, going for a second round with new technology. In games, the term has less history, but in general has come to mean the same thing. With remakes, we expect the same basic premise of a game with new technology, new mechanics, or just a fresh coat of graphical paint on new hardware. With the recent generation's craze of porting last generation's games, we've also seen the rise of all these other terms: enhanced port, remaster, HD edition, but none of them seem to attract the reverence and maybe even fear that the term remake ignites. For some people, remake means replacement, because we're making the game again, so the original version, which exists on inferior hardware, and with worse graphical fidelity, means a lot less now, right? It has been made redundant. I don't necessarily agree with this view. I'm of the opinion that remakes are always sequels to their original works in a strange way. Remakes don't necessarily function like sequels in the traditional sense, but they serve the same role of expanding the continuity of the original story. For something to be a remake, it has to recreate the original product in a new context. This will always incite alterations to the original product, no matter how small, which will make it something new, no matter how much is changed or added. It's connected to the idea of the original by its very nature, meaning it's continuing the original work in a sense. Remakes are in this unique position of being both shackled to the original, whilst also attempting to build on it. I've been shocked to see people commenting, it's not a remake, it's a sequel, when it's pretty clearly both and neither. But this is the internet, we can't have nuance in this discussion. FF7 Remake has always been, and will always be, separate to FF7 as a product, whilst also being connected to the ideas the original presents. It's a sequel to FF7 by virtue of continuing what FF7 began, and a remake at the same time. It's also a companion piece, a prequel, an expanded interquel, an ode, a call-out post, a diatribe, a makeover, a corporate product, and much more. Yes, I am serious about all this, by the way, and FF7 can very much be multiple things at once. I'd probably say most of these things were the case even if FF7R didn't do what it chooses to do, with its weird alterations to the original story. And that's where things get a bit wild, because FF7R is pretty clearly a commentary on the idea of remaking something, and the expectations that brings with it. I feel like analysis of the end of FF7R, on both a literal and a meta level, has already been exhausted, so I won't delve too much into it, but I will naturally get into it when the review of the game begins. There's no avoiding it, I'm afraid. Like many other video gamists, I have a personal connection to the 7th entry in the Final Fantasy series, so I won't pretend that I'm unique in that regard or that my experience with the original game gives me some kind of special perspective on this title. It doesn't. For necessary context, I'll simply state that I enjoy the original Final Fantasy VII rather a lot, and that Square Enix's Final Fantasy series is among my favourite game franchises. The Final Fantasy signature blend of classic JRPG mechanics and a narrative-focused experience is one that has always really appealed to me, and when I indulge in other Japanese role-playing games, I tend to judge them against the high standard that my favourite era of Final Fantasy set. FF7R's status as a remake of one of my favourite games puts Final Fantasy VII Remake in a difficult position from the outset, in terms of assessing its overall quality in the form of a review. This difficulty stems from an inability to place how FF7R should be understood in relation to the original title. Clearly, FF7R cannot simply replace the original game, nor does it show any clear intention to do so, yet it is also uniquely intertwined with the original game, as I've previously mentioned. I honestly feel like I should wait until the entire thing is available to fairly assess it. This becomes even more muddled by the boundaries of this new title, which adapts merely one chunk of the original game. I honestly feel like I should wait until the entire thing is available to fairly assess it, but I think this first part is quite unique in its own right for what it's done and what it potentially will do to the culture of video game remakes going forward. FF7R in that way is a game that's pretty fun to just think about and discuss, which is a nice bonus when the game itself is such a delight to play and experience. If you are ever in doubt about Square Enix's ability to deliver on what people wanted from a Final Fantasy VII Remake, FF7R attempts to dispel any major concerns by delivering a gameplay experience that is every bit as dramatic, exciting, and engaging as the original title, elevated by a simple but rewarding new combat system and the reinvigoration of classic characters with new dialogue, scenes, and small, adorable details. The combat of FF7R is an impressive feat of design. It breathes new life into Final Fantasy VII's many enemy encounters, and gives you a brand new, action-focused way to engage the game's many foes. If you've played Final Fantasy VII more than once, then you'll have surely found yourself growing weary of the turn-based grind at a certain stage. But Final Fantasy VII Remake has a combat system that seems focused almost entirely on keeping you on your toes. Whilst it's not exactly difficult, the new combat system forces very speedy engagement combined with strategic thinking in order to succeed. Each party member has a very unique set of skills and weaknesses, and what appeared as minor encounters in the original game have been transformed into dramatic events on a much larger scale, resulting in boss fights that go on for quite a while. This is something I really liked about the game. The boss fights felt like very real, very intense challenges. The combat system is something very special with only minor grievances, such as the feeling of dissatisfaction when MP and ATB are robbed from you after a magic attack is interrupted, getting trapped in an unforgiving stun lock, or the general uselessness of the dodge button. Some of these issues can be better understood as features of the hybrid RPG action game design, which wants you to treat the game very much like a turn-based experience still in some regards, which explains the lack of efficacy in dodging and certain attacks having no real counter. Despite this, I found the combat to be very satisfying, especially once I understood what exactly it demanded of me. FF7R's combat system succeeds phenomenally in adapting party-based combat into real-time action, with each character feeling like they have something unique to contribute to the overall setup. There is diversity in the way characters control and how they can be utilised as a group. Another remarkable achievement of the Final Fantasy VII Remake is the sheer amount of detail that has gone into realising the world. The environments are impressively modelled and did a fairly good job of recreating the 2D backgrounds and transforming them into a 3D space. With that being said, there were a number of texture pop-in issues that haven't been fixed post-launch that hinder the experience visually in some areas. I thought it was quite sad when certain emotional scenes near Aerith's house had me distracted when I noticed the texture of the flowers. There were a few other technical issues, including slowish load times and the occasional audio stutter. But technical issues aside, and minor gameplay struggles aside, all of the aforementioned positives go a long way into remixing sequences into familiar but greatly expanded versions of classic, red-hot set pieces. One of my favourite moments included an encounter in Chapter 8, a vastly expanded boss fight with adversary Reno that focused on dodging, countering, and precise timing, whilst Reno flies around the church that the battle takes place in, quipping and punishing any errors in your attacks with reckless abandon. It was a vibrant and frenetic encounter that elevated a fairly static scene in the original to an incredible gameplay sequence that I'll never forget. I'll also have difficulty forgetting Reno's pecs, because goddamn, he's stacked now. Moments like this kept coming, particularly in the boss fights, which come often, forming a cornerstone of this revision of the classic game. But boss fights weren't the only surprising or memorable sequences. Cutscenes have been added and expanded to give a broader sense of each character's motivations, hopes, and fears. Another favourite moment of mine was cemented in a cutscene that played after the destruction of Sector 7, wherein Barrett laments the loss of his friends in his eco-terrorist group Avalanche, as well as the potential loss of his adoptive daughter Marlene. This scene was incredibly well performed, and remembering it from the original game really highlighted how much was added by the updated visuals, music, dub script, and the performances of the new voice actors as well. FF7R really goes to lengths to hit the high notes of the original game, as well as creating new ones all of its own. It's special to see a moment you love in FF7 come to life in this brand new way, and it's also wonderful to witness them in a new context. The struggle of Cloud and Avalanche against the mega-corporation Shinra has never felt more relevant to the modern day, especially when it's presented in a suitably modern context. My concern going into Final Fantasy VII Remake was that the incredibly focused vision of the original game would be weakened by the expanded material. To an extent, I can see the argument that it does do this, altering the pacing in an undesirable way. An early section between the first reactor bombing mission and the next, which comes directly after in the original game, is luxuriously padded with a host of side quests and an extended interlude where you hang out with the Avalanche gang. The effect on the characters is nice just by virtue of seeing more of them, but the content of this segment itself, whilst fun, does feel slightly divorced from the rest of the opening chapter, in terms of keeping things moving in an exciting way. It's refreshing to experience something new, but the original game really had a certain strength to its pacing that is slightly undone by the addition of new scenes. After the second bombing mission in Sector 5, the quality and variety of the new content mostly seems to increase from there, mingling with content that is merely remixed, with mostly faithful recreations of key scenes. Even later parts of the game that didn't resonate with me as much still made me feel something. The train graveyard's ghost sub-story didn't particularly click with me, but I really enjoyed the boss encounter in that zone. Similarly, returning to the sewers in Chapter 14 is not exactly something I wanted to do, but I found myself enjoying it, perhaps begrudgingly, because I ended up really liking Leslie. Along with the bafflingly named new addition Chadley, I was starting to wonder when I saw Leslie if these two would need to return to their home planet after their relevant dialogue was over. Thankfully, Leslie surprised me in that regard, whilst Chadley was a mostly perfunctory NPC anyway. Unfortunately, the more controversial new additions to the story don't feel like they always mesh with the original game. I like the meta-commentary, which sees spectres attempting to correct the remake to stay on course with the original game's key moments, but it perhaps could have been more thoughtfully inserted. The physical presence of the plot ghosts might be to the game's detriment. In my opinion, it could have been better if this force was more mysterious and less invasive to the game's pacing. Stopping to fight the ghosts was mostly a tedious affair, as the boss fights with the ghosts themselves were mostly a war of attrition. These ghost encounters appeared at several key points in the game and ultimately frustrated me. I failed to see the need for these encounters beyond the first time, other than to hammer home the idea of fighting fate that ties together these encounters in the game's final moments. On a textual level, I didn't feel as though the reason to fight fate resonated strongly enough with any of the characters that this game had spent such a long time giving such character. This theme culminates in the penultimate boss fight, which felt equal parts grand and self-indulgent. At first I thought it was really cool to be fighting these named Whispers, who had real moves and patterns and interesting lore when you scanned their abilities. It was like the opposite of the previous Whisper fights. It increases its scope exponentially, giving you a quick Bahamut fight within it, and a decently challenging battle overall. It's a shame, however, that the checkpointing system of this game is so weak, because failing the sequence at any part really hinders the experience of it, deflating things as you have to start this very long encounter all over again, with no ability to skip the cutscenes embedded within the encounter itself. But once I was able to come to terms with the length and stakes of this final boss, I really enjoyed it. And then after that, there's even more. One last encounter with Sephiroth, with insane levels of escalation. Although at first I was skeptical about the necessity of this boss, it certainly made for a hell of an encounter. This battle emphasises everything that works in the system, focusing on tight, controlled swordplay and countering, not unlike the fights with Reno or Rufus. What happens after this though will definitely spur a variety of reactions, and I'm pleased to say that I find it really exciting. This is where the concept of fate as a theme started to click. I'm overall in favour of the concept, although I do think its implementation could have been improved, and how the decision to alter key events by permanently removing the Whispers of Fate is highly contingent on how it will be used in subsequent parts of this remake project. For example, I think there is a suggestion of parallel universes, which is an interesting one, presented in the form of a glimpse of a world where legacy character Zack Fair may still be alive. But will we get to see anything in this world that expands upon the original game in a meaningful way? At the moment, it's difficult to say, even if it is fun to speculate. The ending simultaneously canonizes various parts of the compilation spin-offs, whilst also parrying the idea of the importance of canon itself by distancing Remake from the original game. There is a variety of ways this ending could be interpreted, but my personal read is that as well as being a meta-statement on the intention to politely ignore the gospel of the original game and its fans, FF7R also declares that this first installment is going to lead by example, with subsequent games in the series seeking to remix FF7 as much as this game has, gleefully working its way around the classic game's high notes, whilst also attempting to add some of its own. Obviously, not everyone is going to like this new approach that the ending suggests, and that makes sense. A decision like this was always going to be divisive. I can appreciate why people might dislike the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's a weird game. It's a reimagining of a beloved classic, one which manages to completely change the type of game that it is. One that adds all sorts of new nonsense to something that was so concise and devoid of filler originally. It's a game that covers less ground than the original, making it feel drawn out as a result. I can't deny that the pacing feels bizarre. Yet even in spite of itself, there are so many amazing moments in FF7R. But I think what is truly special about it is less to do with those moments themselves, and more to do with the feelings they conjure. As much as it would be nice to wrap up the video there, I'm not quite done yet. Let's take a look at the bookshelf and see what sort of conclusion we can draw from all this. Remember earlier when I said, it's a sequel to FF7 by virtue of continuing what FF7 began, and a remake at the same time. It's also a companion piece, a prequel, an expanded interquel, an ode, a call-out post, a diatribe, a makeover, a corporate product, and much more. Well, guess what? I have another important label to add. FF7R isn't just a remake. Its nature as a remake justifies an understanding of it as a simulation. But what is a simulation? In 1981, some French guy called Jean Baudrillard wrote a philosophical tract entitled Simulacra and Simulation. In it, he explained the philosophy behind the idea of the simulation, and posited that he believed we are living in an increasingly simulated version of society. Simulacra and Simulation organises the idea of simulation into several stages in a process. The first stage is a faithful image/copy, where we believe, and it may even be correct, that a sign is a reflection of a profound reality. The second stage is a perversion of reality. This is where we come to believe the sign to be an unfaithful copy, which masks and denatures reality as an evil appearance. In order to explain it in Baudrillard's terms, we could describe the events of FF7R as reaching the second stage of the act of simulation, where some form of reality has been copied and then distorted the truth of the situation through this act of copying. This happens in two different ways in FF7R. In the game, firstly, as part of the story, and secondly with the game itself as part of the meta-narrative. Just generally, the game approaches the idea of simulation directly a few times, with the existence of the Shinra combat simulator. This was particularly interesting to me because some of the most important summon characters are only positioned in boss fights in this simulation before you unlock them as summons. These characters would previously be obtained as materia through some sort of encounter, but here they're only obtainable based on Chadley recreating them from the data in a fight. This is also the only area in the game where you hear the original victory fanfare, and not in a sort of weird organic way. There are several particularly good examples of the idea of simulation that masks and denatures reality, which can be seen in the way that Shinra chooses to present itself to the world. We get glimpses of this in the upper floors of Shinra Tower, which includes a Shinra Memorial Museum, as well as the Cosmos Theatre to present a distorted version of reality to tourists. As Shinra tells their version of events and morphs the truth, it becomes a simulation as Baudrillard describes it. The first thing we interface with in this area is a digital hologram version of a receptionist, effectively a simulation of this role. In the museum, we have model versions of enemies we've encountered in the game, as well as President Shinra himself, who is rendered entirely as a gold statue. Shinra is simulating reality by copying it, distorting it, and representing an ideal version to the public. This act of simulation is what allows Shinra to effectively control public opinion. The gold President Shinra isn't just an artistic flair for the statue, this is how President Shinra wants others to view him. Pristine, shiny, important, valuable. Barrett in some way seems to be aware of this fact, and laments it in another touching speech, as the party takes in a glimpse of the outside from the window. Amid the suggestion that people might appreciate this view, Barrett suggests that these brief moments of beauty are exactly what blinds people to the truth. In essence, people are being controlled by a simulation produced by Shinra's hegemonic fascist regime, an illusion that is perpetuated by almost every aspect of Midgar's regime above the plate. Any indication of the real truth about Mako energy or the Ancients is dismissed by Shinra, and it seems as though Shinra is willing to entirely subjugate the Ancients, essentially masking and denaturing the reality. The idea of simulation really pushes to the forefront, though, when our heroes enter an audio-visual simulation experience produced by Shinra to explain the entire history of Midgar and Mako energy. What begins as Shinra propaganda eventually comes crashing down, as Cloud sees Sephiroth, as well as brief flashes of the original version of Final Fantasy VII. This is because Shinra's simulation is being interrupted by another simulation. The simulation of the game of FF7R itself. To understand this, we have to understand how FF7R is a simulation on a meta level. To put it simply, in the same way that Shinra casts doubt on the past and masks reality with their own version of it, FF7R as a game does the same thing. The Whispers of Fate are essentially trying to guide the actions of Cloud and the gang so that they stay on course with a certain version of reality. This reality is essentially the version of events that fans understand to be the truth, the original version of FF7. But clearly, this version of Cloud and the gang seem to want to make up their own mind about what their fate is, routinely breaking free from the guiding force of the Whispers by fighting them. If the Whispers are the only thing tethering Cloud to reality, then the game itself casts this path to reality as evil. I mean, they're literally weird-looking death ghosts. The final encounter with Sephiroth culminates in a cavalcade of moments that simulate the original game's actual final encounter, but they merely refer to the original events, acting as signifiers to point your memory to the truth of FF7. There are at least a few more examples I can think of, but the point is this. FF7 Remake assumes your knowledge of the original and then playfully, gleefully dances around it, distorting the original events and operating on the basic idea of simulation. And I love it for that. But the difference is, the truth isn't becoming obscured when we look outside of the text of the game itself. And that's because FF7 is still around. Final Fantasy VII Remake is incapable of encapsulating the original. You can still go and play it, and I highly encourage you to do so, it's a classic. The question remains though, about what FF7 Remake will become. It's almost definitely too early to tell. It's especially too early to tell what relationship the remaining parts will have with the original game. It's fully possible that we could have a game that chooses to be mostly new, or maybe it will carry out another performance of simulation like this one. Thank you for watching my latest video. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out in some ways, but I'd also like to improve on it in other ways, so let me know what you thought of it, and let me know what sort of thing you'd like to see next. I've got more Tokusatsu videos coming up, and I've got also some other kind of interesting things that you might enjoy. So if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and following me on Twitter for more updates.